is, what is your resilience quotient? With leader Richard Koral. Dr. Richard Koral is one of the leaders here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. He is also serving as part-time leader for the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. Richard studied at the Humanist Institute and holds a Doctor of Ministry in Interfaith Pastoral Counseling from the Hebrew Union College, as well as several other degrees and diplomas. Richard is a longtime member of the ethical culture community, having been a member of the Ethical Culture Society of Westchester for many years. He served as its president in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was also active with the American Ethical Union, our national federation, serving on its board for a time as its president from 2012 to 2015. Richard lives in northern Westchester with his wife of 37 years, proving that a marriage sanctified in ethical culture will endure. Please welcome Richard Koral.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to spring. Isn't it wonderful that it's spring this week? It's our first meeting in spring. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So it was a close call actually getting to spring. I mean, we just really made it. And that last set of nor'easters really walloped us in Westchester. That the first two knocked out our electricity, so we were without electricity for 6 days. And it's fun for a little while, you know, it's like camping, you know, but after a while it gets old fast. And we live in a time when electricity really runs everything. And so when you have no electricity, nothing operates. And really had to endure. It was something to tolerate. They're calling on my reserves of resilience. And but it also made me feel what others must endure. This is just a small taste, 6 days, you know, without electricity. But, you know, thinking of other people in the world, for example, in Syria, where they are blowing each other to bits. And, you know, when we live in the modern age where we are so dependent upon this, the mechanisms of civilization working, and when the plug is pulled, nothing works. What there is to endure is really amazing. And of course, this was a natural event. I could sort of blame nature. And of course, it came back. But when the cause is that of other people and the nastiness of this kind of brutal war, it really puts a perspective on one's suffering. And I wonder, do I have the resilience to endure that kind of experience? What if it befell me or my people so suddenly as it befell them? Well, one of the classic examples of resilience, of course, is offered in history is the Battle of Britain, right? You'll remember the story. After the fall of France, Germany turned its attention onto Britain and threatened to overrun it. The Operation Sea Lion was the name given to the invasion of Britain. It was a massive operation. It was going to involve thousands of boats and barges, bringing waves of soldiers to overrun the British Isles. But first they had to silence the British Air Force, which had been patrolling the English Channel and was bombing the European coast. So the mighty Luftwaffe commenced its attack on the British Air Force over the Channel and southern England with the aim of knocking their planes out of the sky. And they did this for a good couple of weeks, but they never seemed to diminish the number of planes in the air. And failing that, the German strategy then changed. They decided they'd bomb the airfields instead and try to cut the legs off with the RAF. And so with their renowned German efficiency, they bombed almost all the airfields all the way up to the Scottish border. But after several weeks of this, they still didn't see that they'd won, so they changed strategies again and then decided to bomb London. As you recall, the famous British tenacity held up and the air cover maintained its strength, and After a few more weeks, the Germans abandoned the plan entirely. So this was the legendary story, right, of the bravery of the RAF and how never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Remember those great words of Winston Churchill. But after the war, once the books were being written and the stories were being shared, it appears that the British side was a lot more fragile than it had appeared to be. The Germans didn't know how close they came to victory. The first strategy of attacking the British planes reduced the stock of planes, not to mention the men who flew them, to dangerously low numbers. As the weeks wore by, the British could only make a show of force just by scrambling groups of planes together. Had the Germans continued this strategy for just another couple of days, they would have succeeded in exhausting the RAF completely. And the British knew this. But the Germans gave up that strategy and they changed their plan. But despite the reduction of the airfields, the remaining number of planes seemed to remain. How was that? The German success in destroying the airfields meant that the British planes could only land in fields that were further and further north. Eventually, the only active airfields were so far north that the fighter planes had only enough fuel to fly to southern England, go around a little bit, and then go back. So they could only make a show of themselves and before returning to their home base. But they did it. They made the pretense of patrolling to make a presence felt so the Germans would believe that they were there. So the British knew that for all intents and purposes, these flights were useless, except for the purpose of show. But once again, on the verge of success, the Germans decided to change the strategy. Instead, they turned to bombing London, and for all the misery that caused to the citizens of London, it gave the RAF a breathing space to replenish its forces, restore its airfields, and regain a presence in the air. So by the end of September 1940, after just about 2 months of this whole battle, the Germans gave up. Had they pursued any one of their strategies for just another couple of days, the RAF would have been finished and the British would have been open to invasion. The British knew this, but the tenacity and resilience of their defense led them to just not give up. They could have been realists. They could have seen that the defense was completely illogical. The forces of Germany were so superior in numbers, it was plainly irresistible. But they just did not give up. They resorted to ingenuity and they persevered. So what really is the lesson in that for us? We're not at war, but resilience does arise really only in some kind of a conflict. Personal conflict, situational pressures, struggles. It's only relevant when we're confronted with a challenge that tests our capacity to master it. Does that sound familiar to anyone here? Anyone experienced that? Well, of course, we all have. In fact, we're all survivors of these challenges that we've met along the road. We found some way of handling it, and we've moved on. But did we do the best we could? Did we compromise more than necessary? Every challenge requires a measurement of how much to invest in it, how much to pursue the struggle, when to back off and let go. There is a lot of failure. We throw up our hands, throw in the towel, throw in the sponge, pack it in, move on. Failure is part of the human experience. Many of you know that I spent a career working with business failures as a bankruptcy lawyer. You know that? I made a profession of failure. I worked with many small and medium-sized businesses, family businesses, partnerships. Existential challenges came from all directions, and the experience was usually highly challenging and traumatic. People who own their own businesses aren't merely subject to disappointment. They were wholly invested in their business. To them, it was their child, their creation. Their ego was invested in it, and its failure and demise was blended with their own existence, and there was a lot of fragility. Great efforts would be made to save the business, often too much. That is to say, people would pauper themselves in the hope with just another extra bit of effort, more risk, more borrowing, it could turn a corner. When the struggle was lost, it was traumatic. There was sometimes talk of suicide. But I often found that a few years later, I would meet a person again, and there they are. They're in business again. They bounced back. They started up. These entrepreneurs were highly resilient. In fact, many successful people in business have failure in their background. I used to laugh about it and say, scratch the surface of any successful business person, and you'll often find Chapter 11 under there. Maybe failure was important to their success. Having struggled meant they understood that perseverance brings rewards. Google, I understand, tries to generate an acceptance of failure as a means of cultivating resilience, encouraging creativity among its researchers. I've heard that in their laboratories, which they call invention factories, they support failure as a way of inoculating researchers against the fear of risk-taking and of cultivating flexibility and creativity. Now, with any institution, and Google being a new company, it's now like an institution, would ordinarily have a tendency towards conservatism, to avoid embarrassment, right? To choose the path that will save face. And that's not what you want in cutting edges. So you want people who'll jump off a cliff, so to speak. People who'll have to have overcome a natural fear of failure. So when the project does fail, they'll bounce back with a new plan, strive to overcome the shortcomings, make it work. To err is basic humanness. St. Augustine said, I err, therefore I am. Just think of all the great ideas that turned out to be wrong or went nowhere. We fear making mistakes because we think it reflects on our self-worth. What we fear is the stigma of being wrong and the inability to recover from a failure, both the ignominy and the black mark. If you can bounce back, though, the cost of being wrong is much lower. Not everybody exhibits resilience, or not enough of it, at least when the moment really, really calls for it. There are people who drop out of high school. There are people who return to drugs, admit to culpability rather than go to trial, stay with the bad boyfriend, leave the profession, take the lesser position, take no for an answer. A certain amount of resilience is necessary in life, or a person is really only a ping pong ball. There's a cost to lacking resilience. 1 in 8 adults experiences extreme anxiety, they say. 1 in 6 experiences depression. 1 in 3 adults experiences extreme stress. A sense of fear, a sense of hopelessness. These accompany a lack of resilience. People can get into a cycle of negative expectations and feelings of inadequacy. You might feel that you're plainly unable to succeed. And of course, once stuck in that kind of a negative trap, it's hard to break out. You typecast yourself as unemployable, as unlovable, as failure, and then you fulfill that role. So what is resilience? Who has it? How do you get it? Resilience is defined by the dictionary as the capacity of a strained body to recover its size and shape after a deformation caused by compressive stress. Sounds familiar, right? I was made to think of those Spalding high bounce balls, those rubber balls. I was going to bring one to demonstrate, but just bounce all over here and scare everybody. So say you throw the ball on the ground and the impact flattens one side, but the ball is under pressure, and instead of going splat, the surface pushes back and restores its shape at high speed, and that's what propels the ball back at you so fast. It doesn't work unless it's impacted, and its recovery is what makes for the high energy bounce. In a similar way, you don't know if you're resilient until you've been tested by adversity. It's all about the challenge and the rebound. You don't get the advancement without the challenge first. There's been some research on resilience, and the question is, where does this special strength lie? Is it an internal trait, a disposition, or are there external factors, environmental factors, such as luck? Were the British just so full of pluck, or did they succeed because the Germans gave up first? One researcher named Emmy Werner, she studied developmental psychology in the University of California in Davis, just died last year. She studied resilience in children. She concluded that those children with resilience had what she called an internal locus of control, meaning that they, the children, believed that they really affected their own fates instead of merely being shaped by others or pushed by circumstances. She said that it was really all a matter of perception. They made a judgment. Is this event a challenge or is it a trauma? There was a difference in the way a resilient child construed the event. So it wasn't really the event itself. What mattered was whether the adversity was allowed to become traumatic. So for our purposes, the question becomes, how can one frame issues in a more positive and less emotional or tragic way? How can we master the challenge by redefining it? Emmy Werner also discovered that some children had resilience early, while others developed it over time. So that raises the suggestion that it can be learned or cultivated as a trait. So we can start by asking, what is your explanatory style? You can say, you can change from global to specific, which would mean this is just one event. It isn't my whole life. It doesn't define me. I can move on. I can be flexible and work around it. So you're making it smaller. Change from permanent to impermanent to say, I can change this. It doesn't control everything. This doesn't set me off for the rest of my life. And you can change it from internal to external, basically to say, well, it's not really my fault. Now, we usually rub it in, these things, and demand that people, take responsibility, own up to their shortcomings. And maybe there's a safety mechanism, a savings mechanism going on when someone blames everyone else for their failures. It leaves some space to recover, and we should be quiet and let them restore their shape, a little bit. But we jump on people maybe a little bit too much and let that define them. Well, absent resilience, there's a danger in relying on the hurt like an addiction, obsessing on the reason for failure, the heartbreak, the injury. Reliving it can be obsessive. I can't tell you how many divorced people I've met who just cherish their hurt like a precious jewel. They won't bounce back because they've adopted the flat ball as their symbol. They just can't be flexible. Psychologist Susan David wrote a book encouraging what she calls emotional agility. Instead of locking down on your emotions, she calls for being instrumental with them, accepting the validity of your emotions and observing your emotions, basically understanding that your emotions are data. They inform you about your condition, but they don't define you. So you should ask, what is my anxiety telling me? What is my anger telling me? And then what action will take me towards my values to step out of them and build your own restoration. So what is your resilience quotient? Someone developed an assessment to determine if you're resilient and to what degree. Basically, a list of traits, so you're to self-assess whether and to what extent you have it. And here's a typical list of factors. One, they would say, a sense of purpose, sort of having a lodestar or a goal outside of yourself by which you can align your direction. When I was a Boy Scout, they used to say that when you're in the wilderness, you tend to walk in circles. And so how to get out of the wilderness, they say, to sight a distant object and align yourself with that, go towards that. And that is the way you overcome your natural tendency to go off and to find yourself. So in the same way, you can sight a line in accordance with your values. What do you hold to be of value in that circumstance? Perseverance, number 2, that old stick-with-itness. There's something to be said about pushing yourself to just do it. From nothing, definitely nothing comes. A third idea would be to remind yourself not to dote on regrets. We're encouraged to learn from our mistakes, but as you know the old saying, when does analysis become paralysis? Stay true to your values, maintain a can-do attitude. Optimism is something that one can cultivate by keeping one's sight line high. Humor. Do you have humor? Do you bring humor to your circumstances? Do you preserve a sense of proportion through humor? Can you see obstacles not as barriers but as challenges? Can you maintain a determination even against long odds? And remember what's most important, or as they say, don't sweat the little stuff. I would add something else. To take the time outside of the situation and do something completely different. There were times when I was stuck in a rut on trying to solve a problem. I would always come back with the same solution. And you'll keep doing that. I'll find I'll keep doing that. So sometimes you just have to get off the merry-go-round and you have to look at something completely different. So like go to a museum, go see a silly comedy, read a spy novel. You never know where your answer will come from. So what we learned here, it's less the situation and it's really more the attitude. It's what you bring to it. So query, can you encourage yourself to have a positive attitude? There are some people who can talk others into having a positive attitude, and I would classify teachers in that category, and I've known some teachers who actually were talented in that way. Last week, I was so fascinated listening to Kurt Collier talk about the students who were involved in his environmental work. Now, there are some battles that we know are just too important to lose, and that is graduating high school. So his students that were involved in his environmental project all graduated high school. And this is in a school district where there's very low percentage of graduation rates. Not only that, a large number of them went on to college. So how did they do it? He described how he fostered an atmosphere where the students were respected and encouraged to respect their own work. They participated, as Kurt explained, as scientists. So was this a matter of spirit? Yeah, it's a matter of spirit. It's a matter of encouragement. The scientific process in that instance, searching for the truth, is exhilarating. And to realize that you can be a part of that is a good foundation for a high energetic bounce. There was a fine little book written about 10 years ago called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. It was written after the Iraq War began, and many progressives were thrown into a serious funk over the failures of values and the regressive direction in which our country was being headed. Our nation was suddenly made to stand for interference, chaos, and a kind of gunboat diplomacy. Many progressives had simply lost hope. Hope in progress and the inevitability of justice and democratic values. Boy, compared with today, it almost seems like a simpler time, you know? Maybe the past is made smaller by the fact that we seem to have gotten through it. Of course, a couple of 100,000 people necessarily died, but that's a detail. Well, she quotes Václav Havel, who said, "Hope is not a prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. So the author goes on to argue that progress is made by people, by movements, and is never a gift from leadership. Therefore, the power really is in our hands. We can choose to exercise that power, and we must choose. She quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald with the familiar quote, at least the first part's familiar. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. And he goes on to say, one should, for example, be able to see the things that are hopeless and yet to be determined to make them real. For the refugees who have streamed out of the upheaval in Syria, or from the Nazis mid-century, or from the famines in Ireland, from religious persecutions, from slavery and Jim Crow in the southern states, to those who have chosen the Me Too, hands up, don't shoot, for all of us who have been tested by adversities, challenges, great and small, challenges in our jobs, challenges with our children, challenges in riding the subway. Even for me, in my cold, dark house in the snow, resilience is a power of mind that enables one to emerge and overcome. It's in your power to summon up your stock of resilience and make a difference with your own hands. Thanks.